What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 114, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Lanslone. Today, I have Patrick MacFarlane back on as a guest. Pat's been on this show several times, on Foreign Policy Focus several times. He's a writer and a podcaster at the Libertarian Institute, and his show, Liberty Weekly, is definitely one of the best libertarian podcasts. Just a really cool variety of shows, Pat. I haven't gotten all the way through your episode with Prof. CJ because me and you were both just listening to Scott Horton on Tim Pool's podcast. But I did start that show, and it's excellent. But it's such a kind of a different variety from, a lot of I mostly focus on foreign policy, where you just kind of cover a variety of libertarian issues, but usually in depth and, and with just like a lot of great content. So I really like your show. I really recommend it to everyone. And, find it at the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find my show, my news roundup. I'm libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle. He's libertarianinstitute.org/Patrick. Or if you go to the home screen of the Libertarian Institute, there's a long list of podcasts over there on the side. The Scott Horton Show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest, Don't Tread on Anyone, Your Show, Liberty Weekly, and then Year Zero. So a great lineup of podcasts that includes Pat. So definitely check out the Libertarian Institute and be sure to share all of our work from there. Also support this show by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde. The website is palomaverdecbd.com. Again, palomaverdecbd.com. They have a great lineup of different CBD products. So no matter what you're looking for, I personally like their topicals. I use their sports cream quite often. It has a nice menthol smell rather than like the old, Bengay kind of smell. And it doesn't have like the extreme temperature swings of icy hot. And it works pretty quickly and it lasts just as long as any of the other products I've used. So I definitely recommend that. But they also have soft gels, gummies, extracts and tinctures, and even some products for your dog. So check out their long list of products at palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. They'll save you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. And now, Pat, let's get into the show today. We have, I think, probably the most important topic to talk about, Pat, and that is the United States really realigning its foreign policy towards great power competition. There's several ways that you could see this, in the botched Russia reset under the Obama administration, and eventually conflict with Russia and Syria and Ukraine, the expansion of NATO, also with the pivot to Asia, again, during the Obama administration, where we really start getting concerned about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait. So this has been a trend for several years, but the increased hostilities through NATO expansion, which have been going on since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Clinton administration, and again the pivot to Asia, and Trump really ramping up not only the military side of hostilities and tensions with China, but also the trade war as well. We've entered this era which the foreign policy thinkers, the blob types, are calling a renewed great power competition, and so there's been a lot of talk of this on Foreign Policy Focus, Pat. In fact, on one episode, me and Will went into Mattis's 2018 national security strategy and broke that down, where they outlined that great power competition. But really, we're seeing it in full effect now. So let's talk about where this has essentially left the U.S. in relation to Russia and China. And there's going to be a great article today on antiwar.com by Ray McGovern going over how the great power competition is ramping up, and China and Russia are actually looking at maybe having more not competition but cooperation because of the increasing hostilities from the U.S. So Pat, I'll let you pick up from there and tell us what you've been reading and writing about. And everybody should know that Pat has a great article coming out hopefully sometime this week on this subject.
Yeah, so thanks for all those kind words, Kyle. I really appreciate it. I'm always glad to join you. And this article, the working title is "The Flowering of Renewed Power Competition." And so I didn't, I decided to take a deep dive on this issue. And kind of what frames it is that the foreign policy wonks have this grandiose opinion of themselves, like there's some, I don't know, conquistadors sitting on a precipice overlooking, thinking about all of their grand vision for the world and moving the pieces on the grand chessboard. And what they do is they come up with these ideas of this grand strategy ideas of global affairs. And so if we look back towards the past, we've seen these visions play out. The Cold War is one of these grand strategy terms. The war on terror, counterinsurgency, and of course the latest one is renewed power competition. And they always have these kind of clunky titles to them, which I think are kind of funny. But I think in a way they're kind of meant to keep people disinterested.
You know what? And
So
they're also a little intimidating and academic sounding too. Like if you're somebody that says we don't need to go to war with China, we don't need to have conflict over Taiwan, they'll say, well, you just don't understand renewed power competition, and most people don't understand what that is, and they feel kind of stupid for not understanding what that is, even though it doesn't really sound like anything. And it's a way for people to really bully people who don't have a deep understanding of U.S. foreign policy.
yeah, and my big concern with Kyle, and I'm sure you kind of share this concern, is that this is really a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is that
Mm-hmm.
the foreign policy establishment comes up with this idea. They say, okay, everyone, we're moving into this new era of renewed power competition, and this is what it's going to look like. Then everyone starts thinking in those terms.
Yes. And so then all the focus of the shipbuilding is shipbuilding to deal with China. The missile builders are concerned, the nuclear weapons are concerned, and also just look at we had the global war on terrorism, and what it spread terrorism across the globe. Yeah, on 9/11 there wasn't that much Al Qaeda. There were a few people that were getting blown apart by U.S. bombs as they tried to run from their caves in Afghanistan, across the essentially imaginary line into Pakistan. And really, other than that, there wasn't a huge Al Qaeda presence. But then, the U.S. went to Afghanistan, but more tragically into Iraq, and just absolutely wrecked the place and created a massive terror problem that Obama only further spread into Libya and Syria and elsewhere into the Middle East, with either supporting or opposing different uprisings and stuff like that. And so I don't see any reason why, when you have the same kind of situation, look, the Predator and Reaper drones were meant to surveil and take out terrorists, and now they're an iconic symbol that rallies people to the cause of terrorism. It's absolutely insane. And so yeah, I think you make a fantastic point there, where this is could very well play out like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if the US keeps sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, then China is going to develop military capabilities that could deter the US from protecting China from protecting Taiwan from a Chinese attack. And then the U.S. is going to say, well, now look, we can't do anything if China wants to take back over Taiwan. And so China could take back Taiwan. But a lot of that was provoked by the U.S. hostile, actions in the area. We have our Coast Guard sailing in this region. I'm sure to the Chinese, they're like, look, this is the old gunboat diplomacy that led to, a century of Chinese humiliation, that this isn't something that, historically China is going to tolerate, and they're going to prepare themselves against. And so now, yeah, people are going to point and say, look at the capabilities that the Chinese are building up. Although I think they call most of their capabilities like area deterrence. They're not trying to be able to, take over San Francisco and invade Los Angeles and, use Hawaii as now a Chinese military outpost rather than an American one. What they're looking to be able to do is sink any U.S. warships that are in the South China Sea, or, maybe if China were to take Taiwan back by force and was trying to blockade the island or something like that, they would look for the capability to defend that blockade. But again, that's far different than trying to even go as far as take Japan or Guam or something like that.
In the same way you kind of talked about how the war on terror created more terrorism. Well, I think that this return to renewed power competition, or excuse me, this renewed power competition is having the effect of driving China and Russia closer together because I sent you over a link, Kyle. China's a Paper Tiger, this awesome piece by the late Justin Raimondo, talking about how, in the past, Russia and China didn't always get along very well together, and they've had a very complicated relationship. And I mean, you were just talking about this, Kyle, is how our aggressive stance and all the things that the U.S. government, especially the Navy, is doing in the Strait of Taiwan, is causing China to get closer to Russia. And I mean, it just makes sense. Why, if you have, let's say there's a big bully on the block who keeps talking about how he's going to beat you up. Well, are you just going to, walk alone from school by yourself, or are you going to try and get some of your buddies to walk with you? It makes sense.
Right. Well, and then there are concerns from Russia and China about territory, like could Russia try to invade China? And then I think Russia has like actual real concerns about China trying to take what would that be, eastern Russia, which I guess is like pretty uninhabitable and sparsely populated territory out there. And in the past even several years, Russia developed a new kind of short-range missile that could be equipped with a nuclear weapon. The U.S. said that this missile violated the INF Treaty. There's some questions about that, and the U.S. Violates the INF Treaty as well. So something could have been worked out. I'm not saying that the INF Treaty should have been dissolved, but the point of this is that wasn't out of concern to put these missiles in like around Moscow and point them at, say, Paris or something like that. The purpose of these missiles was to put them on their southern front with China because they were concerned about again, more Chinese than U.S. intervention. So there's a lot of things going on between Russia and China where, to be honest, it seems like for them it would be easier to get along with the U.S. There's absolutely, well, there shouldn't be. There's a giant ocean in between, so there really shouldn't be any territorial concerns between the two nations. And China doesn't produce a lot of fuel, so the U.S. does. And so if China and Russia aren't great trading partners, then China might buy more fuel from the U.S., which would be good for the U.S. economy. Russia doesn't have an extremely developed economy, so they could buy like more advanced kind of equipment from the U.S. These things could work very well, and I think it's in the McGovern article that he points out that China and Russia have signed a multi-decade agreement for China to buy Russian fuel because again, it's a safer partner than the U.S., who is looking to cut China off everywhere and constantly be provocative. I believe some of the recent talks, Pat, between China and Russia occurred after the meeting in Anchorage between the U.S. and China, which got off to this horrible start with the U.S. first condemning Chinese human rights violations, and then China responded by pointing out U.S. Human rights violations. And after that, I believe Chinese and Russian foreign ministers, I think Sergei Lavrov met with the Chinese foreign minister, and they were like, well, look at the situation that we're both in with the U.S. So this is certainly something that the U.S. should be aware of and concerned about. And it seems a self-fulfilling prophecy, as you said before, of the 2018 national security strategy and Obama's pivot to Asia and NATO expansion, that if we continue to push against the red lines of these countries, like sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, like trying to expand Ukraine into NATO, Russia is going to look for partners that are agreeable and sanctioned. The U.S. sanctions both Russia and China, so I'm sure looking at bypassing U.S. dollar and stuff like that will work well for both of these countries as well.
Well, and there's kind of an interesting parallel between the situation with China and Taiwan in the United States and Ukraine and Russia in the United States and NATO. It's just interesting how the two great powers that we're supposed to be in competition with are the main source of strife between us concerns neighboring countries, or in the case of Taiwan, however you feel about whether or not Taiwan is an independent country. But this is what the founding fathers warned us about. And I not want some to blindly worship the founding fathers, but they had a point when they said, don't get into entangling alliances. And Kyle, you sent me this article about from the AP about McKenzie.
Yes, this is
Um,
General Kenneth McKenzie, who is the guy in charge of CENTCOM, which is Middle East Command. I think pretty much from Israel through Afghanistan, Pakistan.
well, and he's concerned, see, because this pivot to Asia means that we don't get as much resources towards, the wars, that the mass murder campaigns that we started but didn't really finish because we couldn't finish them. So taking all those resources, he's concerned that China and Russia is going to have growing influence within the Middle East and other places like Africa and South America. So it's just it's interesting how we overextend ourselves like this. But I don't particularly buy into the idea that, if we were to withdraw from Afghanistan or if we were to withdraw from Iraq, that China and Russia would set up shop there right away in the same way that we did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a great point that if you're China or Russia and you've looked at what's happened to the US over the past 3 decades, or even longer, going back to the original coup in Iran or something like that in the Middle East, you had to be an absolute fool to want to replicate that. It's absolutely bled the American empire dry. And so it's really shocking to me that, I guess, anybody would believe this, not necessarily that General McKenzie is saying that. We've seen in the past that this guy is kind of shrewd. Gareth Porter had a pretty good write-up on how he was able to make some pretty influential moves. But basically, I think this guy is looking at losing clout, right? The more the U.S. troops get transferred out of the region, the more bases that close. If you're a general in charge of 25 bases, that sounds a hell of a lot better than the general that's in charge of 2 bases, right? Like, I mean, 2 bases, there's 800 of those things. So there's a real sense of that, I think. Also, look, when it's your job to protect U.S. interests in the Middle East, you're going to see U.S. interests in the Middle East everywhere, and you're going to really believe that your job's important, and you have to protect all these things that for years everybody's argued is important. Checking Iran's been important. Stability in Iraq, women's rights in Afghanistan, being able to check the Pakistani nuclear threat, being able to combat Al Qaeda in the region. These are all things that for years everybody has agreed with. People like General Kenneth McKenzie on that. All these things were incredibly important, and now suddenly they're not. But this guy is a true believer in the mission, so of course he's panicking. Why? Even if your job is stupid, like if you were told you got to type in these numbers 5 times a day, right? Or something's gonna blow up or something like that. Even if nothing's actually gonna blow up, if you're told that job's not important, you're like, what do you mean? I got to do. And so I think there's a sense of that really within just the whole establishment. There's so much momentum and inertia behind it because it's such a massive thing, and there's so many lies baked into it. Whenever the system tries to make any kind of turn, it's like a semi trying to get off the highway going 60 miles an hour. It's not gonna work, and so there's a lot of panic and everybody's freaking out right now, especially in CENTCOM, and I think the Army too, because they're going to be the real losers in all this, and the winners are going to be the Navy and the Marines and the Air Force, who are going to get all these missiles and ships to focus on Russia and China. Now the other thing is here, Pat, is just how stupid is the whole thing, where you're literally pivoting your entire national security strategy to Russia and China, but then you're also concerned about Russia and China coming to fill the vacuum of the other places that you're leaving. It just seems like
It's
everybody wants to use them as the boogeyman.
right, yeah. It's the folly of empire. I mean, it's like I don't know if you have like an outdoor pool and or a dam, and there's all these cracks in the dam, and you're trying to fill the cracks with all your fingers, something like that. At some point, you just run out of fingers. I mean, And I mean, to go back to what I was saying about the founding fathers, this this paragraph right here, if you'll indulge me. In meeting Sunday, Saudi leaders were, quote, very concerned about the ongoing U.S. military posture review, McKenzie said. The kingdom is under almost daily bombardment from Houthi rebels with a variety of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and small drones. And Saudi leaders rely on the U.S. to help them defend themselves. Oh, whatever would the world do if the U.S. wasn't there with the big stick in an iron dome to it's just it's absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean that's a good point also. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that McKenzie isn't trying to grift off of the Israel situation a lot more too,
Yeah.
and to say, look how active and important this area of the world still is, and that we have to remain involved in, in competition here. So, Pat, what else do we need to cover on this subject? I know you're getting into a recent report that was pushing this. What's going on with that report?
Yeah, so this and I think I neglected to send you a link to this, Kyle, so I apologize for that, but this is a CRS report from Congress. So this is the Congressional Research Service. They have an updated report that's been published and republished, updated several different times in the last few years here. And basically what it does is it outlines in detail what a good policy choice and avenue and pathway would be for Congress were they to pursue renewed power competition. So I think that there's a lot of nuggets here, but we're also seeing a lot of this play out in real time. Renewed competition in terms of a renewed Navy military interest in the Strait of Taiwan, also in the Black Sea. There's a focus specifically on supply chain and making sure that the United States has the industrial power to supply its armies and navy and all its military forces. There's also, of course, focus on funding and increased funding. All the things we've discussed about taking personnel and military assets and refocusing them on high conflict zones with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea specifically. But I think the most alarming part is on page 16 here, where they say mobilization capabilities for extended length conflict. So they're talking about increased emphasis in discussions of U.S. defense on U.S. mobilization capabilities. So basically, preparations for activating U.S. military reserve force personnel and inducting additional people into the armed forces. In this report, the term is used more broadly to refer to various activities, including those relating to the ability of the industrial base to support U.S. military operations in a larger scale, extended length conflict against China or Russia. Under this broader definition, mobilization capabilities include but are not limited to capabilities for one, inducting and training additional military personnel to expand the size of the force or replace personnel who are killed or wounded, Kyle. Introducing new weapons to replace those expended in the earlier stages of a conflict, repairing battle damage to ships, aircraft, and vehicles, replacing satellites or other support assets that are lost in combat, and manufacturing spare parts and consumable items. So they're seriously advocating planning for a real war with China and Russia.
Yeah. And I mean, this sounds so insane, Pat. It just has to be a jobs program, right? Like, these are the countries with, I think, two of the three largest nuclear arsenals. I'm not sure China's actually in third place on that list. France has quite a few bombs. Israel has quite a few in a unknown number of weapons. So they could actually be like behind other U.S. allies, but they have 300 or so nuclear weapons, and they have a nuclear triad, and that's enough to go to nuclear war with. If they could
Right.
essentially give as good as they get. I mean, the U.S. can nuke Beijing 14 or 15 times, and they could nuke Tokyo and San Francisco once and twice each, or something like that. And maybe there's some less devastation, but I think the point of civilization at that point is pretty bad. So it seems almost like, Pat, that this has to be a jobs program, that basically the military industrial complex wants to fund these private groups to run these war games, to say we need these weapons, to say that way those weapons get made and they had to spend billions and trillions of more dollars on these wars, but at the same time then people are really going to start to believe in this. They're really going to think that China is this existential threat. They're going to convince the American people of it. And you can go into a really stupid war. Look what happened in Iraq. There was no justification to it. We were lied into it. It was an absolute failure. It made everybody in the U.S. and essentially around the world less safe. And that happened. So it's not impossible that, you know, that this goes from being just like a stupid jobs program into, you know, Armageddon.
Yeah, and I don't want to overplay my hand here to say that this is, you know, not running around like Chicken Little saying that like 80 there's a 80% chance that we're going to go
Right.
to war. Of course, um, you know, there's other, if this is a jobs program, right, which it most likely is, but there's other effects of having some kind of military expansion like this. I mean, spending goes up. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, of course, when you get new toys, you want to use them. Uh, there's also this focus on renewed confrontation. If you have more toys, like I said, you want to use them or at least show them off.
Right.
Uh,
What was that Madeleine Albright quote? What's the point of having this army if you're not going to use it or something like
right.
that?
So,
So yeah, some bureaucrats gonna think that, and you know, we're talking about the best case situation here, Pat. Is they're wasting trillions of our dollars, right? Like
yeah.
low chance that this results in a nuclear war, but good chance that this costs us 100 and something billion. So
In some ways, the prospect of this becoming reality almost makes you hearken back to the days of proxy wars. I mean, as awful as that is, and of course I'm joking, Kyle, but
right,
damn, yeah.
yeah, no, and again, this is one of those things that as the US builds up their military presence, China builds up their military presence, and that makes it more likely for an accident. We don't see as much like in the air over China as we do like over the Black Sea with some of these close light plane interceptions. But you know, one pilot doesn't, you know, react right, drifts the wrong way a little bit. You know, we're talking about a serious international crisis, and it doesn't necessarily have to lead to war, but it is something that's going to create national fervor on both sides. Imagine if, you know, a Russian plane collided into a U.S. plane, what would the Republicans be doing? What would the you know, to the extent that there's opposition hots in China and Russia, they would be crying that the president isn't doing enough, that they have to do more, right? That we need, you know, more war and more conflict. And so that's the kind of situation where this gets worse. And like, again, even if this doesn't escalate into a full scale war or something like that, it's tragic to have the loss of life of the military personnel in accidents. The more you have these flights going on, the more accidents there's probably going to be. And also accidents within U.S. training. We saw at the end of the Obama administration, the 7th Fleet and the Air Force down there were really overstretched. And we had, I think, 8 or 9 pilots or airmen killed in one accident where I think it was a F-18 Super Hornet drifted into a refueling air tanker. You know, we have our ships run into other ships. Like this does cost the lives of our personnel whenever, you know, we run these operations past, you know, their logistical capabilities. And so, you know, there's risk all around here, Pat.
Yeah, and going back to this article, to hit up the last point I wanted to bring up, this Justin Raimondo article, China's a paper target, tiger, and David Stockman has done really good work on this too. But essentially, I love this article because Justin really lays it out. There's a few key points here. One being Austro-libertarians here. We understand how dangerous and destructive Keynesian economics are in the central bank policy. But he writes about how China has imitated the Keynesian policies of the West. The China's political class has created a real estate bubble of ginormous size, one that makes our own real estate bubble of 2006, 2008 seem like a minor price fluctuation. When that bubble bursts, and it isn't a question of if, but when, it will mean a huge step back for the average Chinese worker. Bankruptcies will proliferate because real estate is the basis for a huge proportion of Chinese bank loans, and the fallen prices will set off a domino effect of large-scale deflation countrywide. And I mean, I don't know, Kyle, if you've seen the videos of the ghost cities in China that were built up and bought up with no one living in them. There's gigantic empty cities. And when I say gigantic, I mean like the size of Minneapolis or St. Paul or even bigger.
Right. Yeah, there's so much with China to, get into. First of all, people talk about the internal repression being a need for some kind of US intervention when I think it's worth mentioning that this could cause uprisings within China. That them, while they definitely oppress the Uyghur and Tibetan populations, I think me and you have done shows in the past and have really gotten into that. It's not genocide. There's not organ harvesting going on, but there is a social credit system in China. There is straight state education. There's a lot of things that go on in China that, as repressive as the American state is, I'm happy to be here because of that kind of stuff. But that doesn't necessarily make China more of an external threat to the United States. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. Trying to, what was it, 13 million or so Uyghur? There's a huge number of people that live out there in mostly rural settings. If they're trying to focus on that, then that takes time, attention, funds away from trying to, combat the U.S. Same with Tibet. You also, any problems, you have China with these massive infrastructure projects, but if they start to fail or they're just cost and waste of money, it's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness, actually. And so I think a lot of times that some of these things are used, towards the, American audiences to make us afraid of China. And while we should be disturbed about some things that happen inside of China, that doesn't mean that we should want to go to war or think that any positive could come from U.S. intervention.
Yeah, and I think this is a product of collectivism. This collectivist mindset is that when we think that China's a monolith, when in fact the reality of the situation is that there's tons of different groups in China, there's tons of different ethnicities in China, and throughout their history, Raimondo writes that for most of its long history, China's been divided into warring regions, or in the modern era, disparate factions with antithetical interests. And it's just that people just they think so singularly, and I think it might be because of state education. I'm certainly not above this, but it's part of this collectivist mindset, just viewing everyone over there as Chinese, and that's the only quality that they have. When in reality, things are very complicated. Think about how complicated the United States is and our demographics and the social problems that we have. There are things that we are just not even aware of. I mean, the civil wars that have plagued China that have killed hundreds of maybe not hundreds, but millions, tens of millions of people. I'm just learning about this. And I consider myself to be a person who's pretty well informed.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's a other issue just to show China's weakness too. They say China's expansion is into Hong Kong and Taiwan. I mean, Hong Kong is almost mainland China. It's kind of off the coast, and I mean Taiwan is as close or closer to China that the U.S. is to Cuba. I mean, to have a situation where China can't even take back those areas, should they, if they're expansionist power, they're a pretty poor one at this point. And so again, these are things that people threaten, like, oh man, China is interfering with U.S. Naval operations in the South China Sea. Look how much more powerful they are. And it's like, this is off China's coast that they could maybe compete with the U.S. in, but they really don't even try most of the time. And so these aren't signs that we need to be going to war with China, but really to understand that the Chinese threat, especially to the U.S., is extremely minimal. And if there's, I think, to be a concern with China, it's basically cronyism within the U.S. government to exploit like cheap Chinese labor and stuff like that, and different business practices that elites in the U.S. are able to get in that end up harming middle and working class people in the U.S. But I think that's kind of a separate issue than the whole military one. And because I knew, people point out like some predatory labor practices and how it's hurt the American economy. I think there is some truth to that, but again, that's not really a military concern at all and shouldn't be.
Yeah, and to go back to correct myself, like if you look up the Taiping Rebellion, it's something that Raimondo links in his article. This happened in the mid 1800s, and it resulted in the deaths of 20 to 30 million people, according to Wikipedia. But the point is that China is not a monolith. They've had serious historical, conflicts, and I think that it's a lot less stable than we think. They've also been completely subjugated by other smaller countries like Japan, and like their influence, the influence that Russia's had over China, I think is something that people don't think about.
Yeah. So Pat, what else do we have on this subject?
I think that about does it for now, Kyle.
Okay. All right, great. So before we wrap up, I did want to mention and to leave on some good news today, and that is Abby Martin has won her lawsuit in Georgia. She was there to give a speech at I forget what university, and it was demanded of her to sign a contract, or she was prohibited from advocating for the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. This is a pro-Palestinian movement that says as long as Israel is an apartheid state and wages an occupation against the Palestinian people, we should advocate boycotting, especially products that are made in the West Bank and the occupied territories, divest from those companies. And then the part of the movement that I actually don't myself support is they want sanctions on Israel. I'm not for sanctions on anyone, but I do understand that the sentiment behind it, and in part it's because of the narrative that the sanctions worked to end the apartheid state in South Africa. Anyways, to get on with what happened here with Abby Martin is they had a federal court rule that Georgia's anti-BDS law was unconstitutional, and it's pretty obvious to me that this has always been the case, but these laws are passed, Pat, in dozens of states. And I remember a few years ago there was a Palestinian woman who was living in Texas, and she was doing contract work with a school district as a speech pathologist. And this was a Palestinian woman who wasn't able to participate in this pro-Palestinian movement, or I believe she was forced to choose between that and her job, and I believe she chose her principles over her job. But these are really disturbing laws, Pat. Can you imagine if the U.S. passes a law that says you can't say positive things about the Chinese government, or things that could be interpreted as positive about the Chinese government? Because essentially what this law is, it is a anti-Palestinian law. It's an anti-Palestinian movement law. Now they do cloak it in some of the Anti-Defamation League nonsense about, oh, we have to stop anti-Semitism, which is such a plague in this country, and any kind of pro-Palestinian movement is really just an excuse for Nazism. The Nazis just use Palestine as an excuse to be anti-Semitic, when that's not the case at all. So Pat, you're a lawyer. I was wondering what you thought about this, and let's say me and you are living in a state, and I'm trying to work a job, and they say, Kyle, you gotta sign this contract and not to support BDS, and I say, well, I'm not signing this contract now because you're trying to make me do that, and I go, hey Pat, you're my lawyer buddy, let's go and get this law struck down. You think that's possible and doable?
Possibly.
Anyways, doesn't it seem pretty blanket unconstitutional? And I guess it's hilarious to me that this is usually driven by Republicans, who are the freedom of choice people.
Right. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, Kyle, but unfortunately, First Amendment restrictions have a long history in the United States. Think back to when the Constitution was passed. The Alien and Sedition Acts happened very soon after the Constitution was passed, and in fact, the doctrine of state nullification was kind of born out of that. But basically, there was a a fever in the United States that anti-federalists, people who were opposed to the Constitution's passing, supported the French and the French Revolution. And the Federalists who were in power under John Adams wanted to clamp down on them. So they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts that restricted the speech of certain members of the anti-federalists who would speak in support of France. And it's a crazy story I won't get too much into, but essentially, John Adams and all the Federalists thought that a French army was going to be chartered to land on the coast of the United States, and that Thomas Jefferson would be the one waving the lantern to signal them to come to shore. So there's a long history of this. So it's not surprising. We heard about this also in World War I with Woodrow Wilson's administration. But I think the key takeaway here, Kyle, is that there is a string of case law that is starting to be established in the federal courts, saying that these boycott, divest, sanction, these prohibitions on the BDS movement is unconstitutional.
Right. Yeah, so I guess that's important, right? Because then, if that happened in a federal court in Georgia, that's something that you could cite, even if you're, we're in Colorado where I live or something like that. You could say, hey, look what this federal court decided there. And then there is a right to boycott, right? That's established there. You can't say you have no right to boycott products, especially, a lot of times when people talk about boycotts, they're specifically talking about products that are made in the occupied territories. It's not like they're saying that they're not going to buy products from Jewish people. They're saying that, hey, we don't want to buy these specific products that are made in this specific location. I know that for like a long time, SodaStream, I'm not sure if there's still a company that produces, but for a long time they did, at least. And people don't want to buy that product because it's made in a settlement. So that seems like it should be an absolute right.
And to go off of what you just said about Colorado, the big thing about this decision, as I see it, I'm looking at it right now, is that there already is precedent established in other federal courts saying that these are unconstitutional, right, that these restrictions on free speech are. And so, I think that's wonderful. Well, where, of course, it's not all good news. But let me just kind of walk through it. So the first part of the decision, basically the court's decision says, trying to get to it here, that Martin's advocacy of a boycott, that's the speaker that we're referring to, of the host of Empire Files, that her advocacy of a boycott of Israel constitutes protected activity under the First Amendment. So that's the first prong of the decision. The second prong of the decision, as I get it here, is that this law, Georgia's law, burdens Martin's speech and is not narrowly tailored to further a substantial state interest. And that's important because the federal courts with these constitutional cases set up a balancing test. And there's certain levels of scrutiny that a law has to meet in order for it to be constitutional. And they're saying here that the law does burden her speech and it's not narrowly tailored. So if a law, like a constitutional right is never absolute. If there is a strong enough state interest and it's narrowly tailored, then a law can actually kind of cancel out your rights. Your rights under the Constitution. So and then she says the court says the statute unconstitutionally compels speech. And that she said that she states a claim upon which relief can be granted, that the law violates her right to due process under the 14th Amendment. And this is a Section 1983 case that she brought. But the bad news is, Kyle, is that the defendants from the university who restricted her First Amendment rights cannot be sued in their individual capacity. And can you guess why?
Because they're a state institution.
Yes, qualified immunity. So that's where it comes in.
Oh man, that word. Everybody talks about qualified immunities in terms of the cops, and I do agree, qualified immunity for the cops. I think the real game, though, is qualified immunity for prosecutors and detectives, the sons of bitches who will sit there and say, we got 5 witnesses that said that you did it. We have video evidence. We have your fingerprints on the gun and it's bloody. And if you don't sign this confession right now, I'll make sure you get the chair. And then that poor kid signs the confession and his life's over. And, they comes back to the, cop and the prosecutor who knew about all that. And, well, it wasn't right, but kind of they don't get in any trouble, don't lose their jobs, still get their pension, probably got promoted a couple times since it happened. The taxpayer in the I guess maybe best case scenario, the guy gets a settlement, but then the taxpayer's on the hook for it. So it's just an absolute train wreck, qualified immunity. The other thing I'll point out here, Pat, is a lot of people will, I think, make the point from a libertarian perspective. Well, private companies could demand what they want. And it's just to point out that these are state laws, and most of the time they're directed, not, saying that if a company would like to, they could require that you sign like a Israeli loyalty pledge or something crazy like that. What they're saying is that companies, can't hire somebody like this, or if they do contract business with the state, they can't. And so, this is all state institution. And even if it was just a private company, even if Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whoever the hell wanted to say, like, if you work for this company, you will not support BDS, I think we should boycott that company for that reason. They should let their employees have whatever political positions they want. Some poor Palestinian shouldn't be unable to advocate for his people's freedom because he, has a job driving a forklift at Coca-Cola. And, it's, I think the same principle when it comes down to the vaccine passports and stuff like that, that, we could, say that things are unlibertarian and, wrong for private companies to practice, but I think almost in all cases with this BDS stuff, it is state rules and ties to state companies or state institutions like universities or state funds going to speakers and stuff like that.
So a couple points on that. When it comes to qualified immunity, there's another hidden prong to it as well, is that there's mid-level bureaucrats who are shielded from any responsibility for what they do. I'll give you a prime example that I found in my new position, is that when a tax lister in a county, a county tax lister, when they forget or when they undercharge a owner of a property for property taxes, there's a period where they can look back and the state can come in and charge those taxes from the people who used to own the property. Even if they don't own it anymore, the state can still come and take the money, the tax money from those people. And there's no recourse that you can have against the tax lister for forgetting to do that. Or let's say that there's someone in zoning, if someone in zoning in your county screws up, or if a civil engineer who works for the county has a design error in a road that they're making, well, you can't sue them even if you crash your car and your family dies because of the faulty design of the road.
Right.
So it goes a lot beyond that too, that people just don't realize because the cop issue gets so much publicity. So I think that's another reason why we have to end qualified immunity. I mean, private businesses have to worry about lawsuits all the time, and it makes us better for it. But the state, they just get away with it writ large because of qualified immunity.
Right.
And the other point that I had specifically concerned the BDS issue. So there's something that is kind of wrong, in my opinion, about the federal government coming in and saying that a state law is unconstitutional. And I don't want to open a whole nother can of worms here, but even though we got the result that I think is pro-freedom here, where laws restricting First Amendment freedom of speech are struck down, the Bill of Rights was never meant to apply to the states. The federal Bill of Rights was never meant to. So there's something tyrannical about the federal government coming in and saying, no, your state passed a law saying that BDS is not allowed here. Well, the federal government's going to come in, and even though your state government passed this law, we're going to say you can't do that. There is something tyrannical about that, even though the decision is pro-freedom.
Right.
Do you get what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I do get what you're saying, and this is, there's a lot of kind of libertarian issues where this is the case. Where, let's say, like the government's going to legalize marijuana in a state, but is going to create a licensing board to do it, and it's like, man, I want to support the marijuana legalization, but I know that licensing board is going to be corrupt as hell, and marijuana prices are going to be too high, and it's going to create poor industry because there's going to be like a limited number of competitors, and all these other problems are going to. But like then you see the benefits too. Now I would guess that Georgia probably has in their constitution a freedom of speech little section, Pat. So would that change your mind at all if a federal court is just upholding the like state constitution of Georgia, if their own courts are negligent in it, or is it really should it be solved within the state of Georgia and the state of Georgia's court system?
My opinion is that it should be solved in the state of Georgia's court system, in that it should be the Georgia Supreme Court's interpretation of the Georgia Constitution is what my opinion is. And you can say, yeah, well, if we left it to Georgia, there'd be bad results. Georgia could become California, or they could become North Korea. But in that sense, if you let each state decide this is federalism, if you let each state decide, that freedom is going to exist somewhere, that you're going to be able to choose the policies that you like in different states. Whereas if the federal government has the power uniformly to declare every state must follow this, well, the ship is going to go down if the federal government gets compromised and taken over by fascists or communists or Maoist communists, So if we let the states decide, yeah, some states are going to decide the wrong way, but if we let the federal government decide, everyone has to go along with what they say.
Right. And I think they have talked about a national anti-BDS law in the past. And so, that is a fair concern. I guess the good news is since the federal courts have decided on the state laws as they have, in this particular case, it would seem that the federal law would be pretty transparently unconstitutional since the federal courts have already decided that. And so it would be, I guess, pretty easy to get that law struck down, or maybe even with a little judicial activism, the Supreme Court could even do it. But anyways, Pat, interesting as always, and I don't know, I guess on this one I'm just kind of like pro freedom, like we get a win on it, I'm gonna take it. I guess I don't see this in any meaningful way changing kind of the ongoing interpretation of how the 10th Amendment and 9th Amendments work anyways. Maybe if this were a bigger issue or something like that, I would have more feelings about it, but it doesn't seem to really be changing anything, right? It's just already within what the federal courts do, right? They're going to decide on abortion issues and all that anyways.
Yes.
The gay marriage thing was done by the Supreme Court, forced that on all the states. So, I guess there's kind of bigger prior precedent and stuff for this anyways. But Pat, any final thoughts? If not, tell people where they could find your work, and hopefully, again, everybody, Pat will have his article out later this week, and I will for sure put it out on Twitter and everything. So be sure to follow my account at Kyle Anzalone _ and you changed your account handle on me. It's Liberty Weekly _ or something like that now, right?
Yeah, it's Liberty _weekly. I used to have just Liberty Weekly, but then I went off Twitter and someone else took it. And they don't use it. They don't use the handle. So, but yeah, so parting shot here is that I do celebrate this decision. I think it is good for liberty, even if the underlying structure I don't necessarily agree with. I'm not going to be one of those libertarians that keep saying it's a private company, bro, on my way to the boxcar. So, but yeah, so you can find my work at libertarianinstitute.org /Patrick, or on my website at libertyweekly.net. Kyle, always glad to join you on your show. It's been good talking, bud.
Yep, great to talk to you, Pat. We'll have to do it again soon.